So I'll start by just saying that I think one of the more remarkable aspects of the response to COVID-19 so far has been by far the most rapid deployment of resources to try and have innovation in clinical countermeasures against this virus. We've seen just tremendous efforts among the scientific and public health community and among funders to try and bring about both therapeutics and vaccines at a pace that is unparalleled in past epidemics. But I think as we're seeing these rapid movements and progress going forward, we need to be really attentive to some of the sex differences and gender implications of R&D efforts and ultimately deployment efforts. And in particular, my work is focused on how pregnant women have been noticeably absent or overlooked in the context of R&D efforts. So this is building on a very long history in which women, regardless of pregnancy status, were broadly excluded from clinical research, from medical research. And that really only started to change in the 90s when we started to see some regulatory shifts. We had the NIH Revitalization Act to really recognize that women are not just men. We can't apply the same science. Their bodies are different. And to actually shift the default there to say, well, you can't just exclude women. You need to have a good justification for why. And we started to see much broader inclusion of women in clinical research efforts. We're still lagging a bit behind in a number of areas, but it did improve. But as we saw that progress for women as a much larger category, there was still one group that was sort of categorically left behind, and that's pregnant women. So just to put the scale of this problem in perspective, and again, this isn't just vaccines or epidemic countermeasures. This is sort of overall drugs, vaccines, biologics. So if you look at drugs that were approved by the FDA between 2000 and 2010, 97% of those drugs came to market with a completely undetermined risk in pregnancy. So that means we really hadn't done any study in them, or even very minimal animal studies that gave us no conclusive results. Potentially even more disheartening is the fact that if you go to market with that status of undetermined risk, the estimated average time it takes to move from undetermined to we have some sense of what risk is involved is 27 years. So most pregnant women and their providers are facing a generation's lag of data to inform their clinical decisions and choices. I'll also note, given that I'm going to switch focus very soon to talk specifically about vaccines, is to this day, we have yet had a single vaccine that has been licensed with a specific indication for use in pregnancy. Now, this may be shocking to some of you who know about widespread maternal immunization efforts and the number of vaccines that we do actually actively recommend to give in pregnancy. But it just underscores the fact that the research pathway to get to licensure has not been inclusive or robust enough to actually have an indication for these products, and the labels almost always have these precautionary note, consult your provider before using X. And this has really problematic implications for both policy decisions and clinical decisions. I guess one other note to say is that, again, in the same way that women aren't just men with slightly smaller bodies and breasts, pregnant women are not just women with big bellies. So it's really important to do this study because there are dramatic physiological changes in the pregnant body that occur, and that includes changes to metabolism and changes to the immune system. So we actually do need to study therapeutics and vaccines to have a better understanding of their efficacy, of their safety, and also of appropriate dosing strategies, because that might actually look quite different in the pregnant woman than it would in other types of patient populations. And I know that a lot of efforts have been made and people are kind of skipping certain steps or potentially moving at a much more accelerated pace in the context of moving forward clinical countermeasures for COVID-19. But the need for appropriate data for these interventions for the population at large, but especially for pregnant women, is also true when we have epidemic threats and when we're moving even faster. And this is because, at least for many pathogens, we know that there is disproportionate risk to pregnant women and their fetuses from infection. And we also know that in many cases, there aren't going to be opportunities to do post-market study the way that we would normally say we might proceed with something that's just kind of around all the time. Emerging and re-emerging pathogens pose really difficult challenges for how you actually collect adequate data when there's unpredictability about how long that particular infectious disease is going to be around. So with that, I know that we don't actually know yet. It's still very early on with COVID-19. We don't know that pregnant women are at increased risk. There are some data that we can draw on from MERS and SARS, but again, we really don't know. But what we do know is that there are about 200 million pregnant women out there globally who are potentially at risk of infection. And there's nothing to say that they would be at lower risk of infection. We also know that there are a high proportion of frontline workers, of healthcare workers who are women of reproductive potential. So I think particularly for a lot of women, and I know personally a number of women who are going into clinic or going to hospitals pregnant and very anxious about what it means if they get infected, not only for themselves, but also for their developing babies. Just checking. I just got a notice that my blue jeans quit unexpectedly. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you well. Keep going if you want
Okay.
to keep giving
Great.
context
I'll
to it.
keep going. I just wanted to make sure, and apologies for that. I seem to be having a few computer snafus today, of course, just in time for the webinar. Great. So that's all to say that even if pregnant women are not at disproportionate risk from COVID, but are at equal or similar risk to other populations, out of a duty of social justice, we owe it to them to be inclusive of their needs as we move forward. And what we have seen again and again is that pregnant women tend to fall into this default category of exclusion. If you look at the exclusion criteria for nearly any clinical trial, it's sort of we'll just throw pregnant and lactating women at that mix. And I'm not talking about lactating women today, but I could say many of the same things that I've said about pregnant women applies as well to lactating women. So what we've seen is that they get excluded from research activities, near categorically excluded. This was certainly the case in the Ebola trials of the West African outbreak when we were looking at vaccines, as well as a number of therapeutics. And then we're left with this conundrum that we don't have the data that we would want or need to make policy decisions, to make decisions about the rollout of these interventions. And then out of an abundance of caution, I would say probably usually out of too much precaution, we exclude them from the deployment of very beneficial interventions as well. And it becomes this vicious and unjust cycle of exclusion, where we just presume that we can't do this research because we don't know the risks, and then we don't include them, and then we don't have the evidence that we need, and then we exclude them from rollout, and then we're never able to generate an appropriate evidence base to fairly include pregnant women. And in the meantime, they're often dying at disproportionate levels. So for those of you who are interested, there's a remarkable paper about how this played out in the context of Ebola called Protected to Death, about this systematic exclusion from trials. And the idea is really to avoid repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past, and instead move from this vicious cycle of exclusion to a presumption of inclusion, where we appropriately and ethically include pregnant women in the research that we're conducting at much earlier stages, again, based on an appropriate risk-benefit assessment, where we then have the data that we need to inform assessments of safety, assessments of effectiveness, and then we can appropriately include pregnant women everywhere who may benefit from vaccines and other types of interventions in the deployment of these tools. And one thing just to note about this in the context of vaccine development is that we're seeing a really exciting and interesting shift in vaccine science where we're moving towards platform technologies, so that way the next time that there is a new vaccine against an emerging pathogen, whether or not it's another novel coronavirus, or whether it is a hemorrhagic fever, or whether it's any of the priority pathogens that the WHO has outlined, the hope is that we can leverage the existing platforms and technologies that have been developed through innovations now to essentially swap out the antigen and move forward with that. So not only is the risk of exclusion problematic for COVID-19, both this epidemic and future emergencies, but also potentially for a much broader range of epidemic threats. So recognizing this problem, a number of colleagues and I have been part of something called the PREVENT Working Group. So PREVENT is an acronym for the Pregnancy Research Ethics for Vaccines, Epidemics, and New Technologies. And this project was essentially saying, well, there's got to be concrete solutions and recommendations that can be done. We can't continue to repeat this default of exclusion. and there have to be ways that we can move forward from here. So we launched a set of guidance about a year and a half ago to essentially roadmap what this would look like in the context of emerging and epidemic threats across the life cycle of a product. So I recognize that I don't have time to go into all of the details of the guidance, but I'll highlight a few of the areas that we touched on that play out across the preparedness phase, then focus a bit more on R&D, but also in the context of rollout. So the first thing is something that we need to be doing right now, and that is really addressing in our surveillance activities, in our case reporting, the evidence gap about we actually have no idea what the pathophysiology is of COVID-19 and pregnancy. And we've seen in the past that there's been very limited data, even just collecting pregnancy status, let alone pregnancy-specific outcomes for both the mom and the baby. It's been really heartening to see in this context that there have already been some pregnancy registries set up to say, okay, if you have been infected with COVID-19 and are experiencing symptoms, please provide your data so that we can start to capture this and have a much broader evidence base to understand what the risks and what the disease manifestations are in pregnancy. So there's one group at UCSF that's already started to do this called the Priority Registry, but the hope is that, this is a global pandemic, and the extent to which we can really build out the evidence just around how pregnant women and their babies may be impacted by infection is going to be incredibly important, and it's something we need to be doing right now. The second thing is we need to start thinking about R&D and moving up our timelines to be able to actually make better risk assessments and be able to appropriately include them in evaluations of new products. So the first piece of this is something called reproductive toxicology studies. And these are usually animal studies that just look at potential fetal risks of a new product. And they usually don't occur until just before licensure of a product. Those need to start happening almost immediately, especially for some of the most promising vaccines that are already moving into phase 1 trials now. Because what happens is if we don't do them now, it becomes a huge barrier for fair inclusion down the road when we get to field trials and larger scale studies. Second piece is that for all of the candidates that are advancing through the pipeline, we need to be thinking really carefully about how these products can include study of pregnant women, prospective evaluation of pregnant women in their clinical development plan. So whether or not this is inclusion in larger scale studies once we're at sort of the phase 3 point, or whether or not this is a parallel study, we actually need to be looking at specific outcomes, enrolling pregnant women in studies, looking at safety, looking at immunogenicity, and really getting a better sense of how well these work and what kinds of implications there might be. And the last piece is really a call to kind of shift away from this default of exclusion and to say any time that there is a study that is excluding pregnant women, particularly studies that have prospective direct benefit to those women and or those developing fetuses, that any exclusion requires justification based on scientific and ethical rationale. So this requires a careful risk-benefit analysis done by people who have the appropriate expertise to do this, so by those who are maternal and fetal health specialists. And the only time that they should be excluded is when the risk of those interventions outweigh the benefits of being protected against COVID-19 infections. And that would be a real sea change in this space, but I think it's a really important and really necessary one. And this is essentially grounded on two claims of social justice. So one, that these women who could directly benefit and have this prospect of benefit from enrolling in trials shouldn't just be denied because of their pregnancy status, while other populations who are at risk are able to enroll and potentially receive the benefit of directly participating in studies. But it also has much broader justice implications for all pregnant women who might ultimately be able to benefit from these interventions in the future. So I hope that helps outline some of these issues and some of the recommendations. For those of you who are interested, you can check out pregnancyethics.org to learn more about this project and the recommendations.